This episode is a writer's masterclass. Scott Sonneborn has written and developed shows for Disney, Nickelodeon, MTV, Cartoon Network, and more, and he breaks down his development process for us today, including why writers often pitch too much, how to use character dynamics to generate story ideas, which blew my mind, and it's something I'm still thinking about, and the one question every writer needs to ask themselves: is this fun? This is my conversation with Scott Sonneborn. Here we go. All right. This is the story series, the podcast for writers who break the rules. Scott Sonneborn, welcome.
Thank you.
Scott, you are an incredibly prolific, award winning writer of TV, books, graphic novels. In addition to that, you're the co developer and executive producer, showrunner of Angry Birds Summer Madness, the story editor for the Annie Award winning Ghee Happy series, as well as a slew of other shows across Disney, Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, MTV, from Beavis and Butthead to My Little Pony.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. This is great.
I want to start and just like stay big picture for a second. What are the professional habits that you've developed over the years that you think have served you best?
One thing that has helped me, I think, and one thing I've enjoyed about uh, the things I've been able to do is just the diversity of the things I've been able to do, moving back and forth between mediums and also between like going from action comedy to pure comedy to things for younger kids to things for older kids. Um, and I really, that part of it, I think, has helped me kind of keep things like, kinda fresh because you never know what you're doing. That's why sort of in terms of habits, it's not so many habits, it's more just that every time I'm kinda starting fresh, I don't have any idea what I'm doing, and that, I think, is what keeps you on your toes and keeps you focused, and, you never can fall into a rut because every time it's totally different. And also it kind of when you're able to switch gears between writing a book and a show or writing a comedy and writing an adventure series, that kinda just activates different parts of your brain, I think, and that kind of also just sort of helps keep you, on your toes as well.
As we move forward in our creative careers and our writing careers, I'm always interested about the things that we leave behind to move forward.
Oh, okay.
And is there anything that comes to mind that you've had to unlearn, or professional habits like that? Sometimes when we're starting out, we accidentally develop bad habits that we kind of replace with better ones. As we've, is there anything like that that you can think of that you just kind of left behind and go, I don't do it that way anymore? And
In the beginning, I was when I started out, I had a day job and I worked at, DC Comics as a assistant editor, not doing comic books, but doing kids books, which is how I got into doing books, and we can talk about that later. And then I was writing for Beavis and Butthead at night, and, those were freelance, and so you had these, relatively reasonable deadlines. They weren't due the next day. You weren't doing that all day long. They understood that that was not your day job, and so I would kind of wait to be inspired. You'd wait to be like, "Oh, okay, I feel like I can do this now." And I think one of the muscles you learn is that, or one of the strengths you learn is that you can't do that. Like, you just have to sit down and just do it. Just get the, and again, like, that might mean that, like, for the first however many minutes or hours, it's not that great, and then you kinda get into the flow. But definitely when you do this for long enough, you realize, like, yeah, you don't need to wait for inspiration to hit. You can kinda sit down and force yourself to kind of figure that stuff out. And the other thing, I guess, was a bad habit is the first time I was in, like, a room was in on the show called, Pop-Up Video, which was on VH1 back in,
oh, I remember that.
yeah, it was, like,
Yeah.
the last century, and, so we were all in this one room, and we'd all type, we'd just make our jokes, like, in a big room, and, like, I remember, like, it was a room where we had a window. This is in New York, we all had it was, like, in a high-rise building, we all had these windows, facing out, so we were all, like, kind of, like, our backs were all to each other, which meant that everybody could kinda look over your shoulder and see what you were typing, and I remember distinctly the first time doing that being like, "I don't want anybody to see this. This isn't ready. This isn't ready." And that show really helped me get over that because now it's just like, now I don't care. Like, now you're in a room and you're just, you're spitballing, you're talking out loud. You have to be comfortable with, making mistakes and saying dumb things and having people see works in progress, not waiting to perfect everything before things, go out. Obviously, the final product has to be perfect, but along the way, there are many steps where your boss or their boss needs to see something or where you need to bounce ideas off of people, and you can't sort of, fine tune and fine tune and fine tune before you show your story editor or your showrunner something for the very first time. You have to be able to kind of pitch it and kind of work around it and say, like, well, it's not quite ready yet, but here's kind of what it's like. And I just remember as a younger person being very nervous about that and being like, oh no, I want to kind of make sure every I is dotted and every T is crossed. But that's not always helpful because it's like if you're dotting I's and crossing T's on words that should be cut anyway, it's like then you're not you're kind of wasting time if something,
Wow.
yeah.
You're articulating an early fear I had that I did get over, but so early on, your good friend Guy Tobis has been
Yes.
a mentor and a friend of mine, and
And it's mine
I
as well.
yes, yes, and I remember early on when I was working on Tots for him,
Yeah.
and I would it was my first time second script, but like early days, and I would want to write everything perfectly. I was afraid to write any like the bad version first for fear of someone like Guy looking over my shoulder saying, "Oh, that's your like you write badly first and then fix it." So terrified of that and I had to get over that. But you in your early days had to get over that fear by just literally being in that environment.
Yeah, it was sort of like being in a bullpen really, and you just have to kind of do that. But then I eventually I came out here and then got the chance to, but I always at the same time, and this is sort of the connections. At the same time I was doing that, I was writing all these kids books, um, mostly sort of with Superman and Batman, and the other DC Comics heroes. But then eventually I did most of this for one editor at this one publishing company. He was like, "Well, do you have your own ideas?" And I was like, "Yes, I definitely have my own ideas." And so I got to do some of my own stuff. So I'd always been wanting to do things for kids, and then when I came out here, I got a chance. Someone at Warner Brothers Animation gave me a chance on a DC Comics show called Legion of Superheroes, and so I wrote some of those, and then I ended up, from there, that was sort of my launching point into doing a bunch of other kids stuff on different other animated shows.
And you started to talk about it. What brought you out to Los Angeles?
To be honest, what brought me out was like I'd worked my way up at MTV and I had done those shows and I did another show called Undergrads and but and I had my own pilot there, which where I was developing that with a couple other with some artists and we were sort of getting, I guess, through the process of seeing if that would be the next show there. But that was in the fall of 2001, and then 9/11 happened, and then they closed MTV Animation down, and that was the end of that kind of that building and that sort of, that office there. And so then I was like, "Oh, well, that's sort of what I was doing." And so then I was like, "I should probably, like," I'd always thought about going to LA as, something you should do, I guess, if you're trying to do this stuff. I mean, because New York had MTV and it had a few other things as well, but it never really, and to this day, it kind of never really, it always would get a little bit bigger, and then it would kinda get smaller and smaller, and it kinda never really, I always felt like it was on the precipice of being, big enough that there was enough animation work to kinda stay there and do that, but it kinda never really, for me, it never really got there, so I thought, like, I should move to LA.
There's almost an inevitability to coming out to Los Angeles. It's a matter
Yes,
of when.
it was right, and then to that time, obviously, the ending of MTV Animation, and also, my now wife and then girlfriend was willing to come here then, and that was sort of like, "Oh, that makes it a lot easier to come, out here then," and then I eventually, it didn't happen right away, but then that's when I got the job on Tom Green too, through those MTV connections out here in LA, and so then, Um, that also, just made that make sense too. So then I was here, and then I got this tremendously lucky break where this woman, Marge Dean, who's sort of an animation legend, for no reason at all, I don't know why she did this, but she got my stuff somehow and she put it on the desk of this guy, Rob Hoagie at Warner Brothers, and he hired me to work on that Legion of Superhero show I was talking about.
Rob Hoagie was at Warner Brothers back then doing that?
Yeah, so Rob had been on Teen Titans, the original Teen Titans, and then he
I didn't
was
know
the story editor of this show called Legion of Superheroes, um, and that's really my whole story is sort of tied into him because he was like he was my guy Tobis, and,
that.
guys worked with me and him as well, and sort of he went on to have another show, and I was wrote a bunch of the next one and even more of the next one, and then eventually he gave me a chance to be his sort of assistant story editor, and then he left that show, and I got to take it over as a story editor, and that was my first time being the story
That's
editor.
incredible. Yeah, Rob Hoagie, I mean, yeah, incredibly prolific,
Yes.
creator and showrunner as well, and I first crossed paths with him on my first show, Stretch Armstrong. So right before,
Oh, wow, yeah.
TOS at Disney, I was at Hasbro and Netflix, and he wrote a script for the head writers, and so that was where I first saw his name, and then I've
Yeah.
been seeing it ever since,
Yeah,
kinda
it's
wow.
a good name too, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But no, he's amazing, yeah, and I mean, he really, taught me everything. I really kinda came up under him, and he really kind of, yeah, was the one who sort of showed me how to do this stuff.
That's incredible, and so were there things that you picked up either from him or on the job at your first story editor position that you still kinda use to this day?
Yeah, I mean, I've learned things from all the people I've worked for. You definitely learn a lot, as a story editor working with different showrunners because that's really like,
Mm.
uh, it's just I've just I've been very lucky to work with a lot of different really interesting people, who have very different approaches, and so you kind of pick up bits and pieces from each of them, and And so, yeah, I mean, Rob, I mean, the first time I sat down with Rob, I was just amazed at how quick he thinks, and that's something I've tried to emulate. Is sort of when you sit down, especially in a story break, to kind of work through all the possibilities, but then kind of hone in on something and then figure it out from there, and kind of like so, kind of to work to explore, but then also to be decisive. And so that's the thing that I sort of try to emulate, is to be very open to exploring, but then be very decisive when you've kind of landed on something. And, obviously be willing to pivot if changes have to be made, but the idea of, like, always being open to new ideas, but always leaving a meeting kind of with a direction and with a decision made, and sort of not, trying to avoid kind of being like, "Oh, I guess we'll talk about this more. I don't know," you know? And again, like, things can change. You could go back to it later and you could be like, "Oh, you know what? We did this down this road, but here's where we hit the roadblock. And so we should need to take 4 steps back and go down this slight diversion." But to not be wishy-washy about those things, to be clear and to be focused.
Nothing I found has been made worse by having a conversation about it. It's the lack of
Yeah.
communication that always kinda compounds
Right, and
what
I
the
think,
problem is.
yeah, and I think sometimes with younger writers, and this is what you were hinting at before with, your work with the great, guy, Tobes, which, I can understand why you feel that way. It's also, there's no dumb questions. I mean,
Mm.
and the truth is, the best stuff, the best people ask a lot of questions, and the best work comes out of situations where people have the time and the freedom to ask a lot of questions, to go back and to try different things different ways. And that's sort of like something that I think people don't, certainly younger people maybe don't see as much. That the great ones, they don't just sit down and just sort of bang it out and hand it in. The people who always are, are usually consistently doing good work, are the ones who are asking lots of questions and trying different things, and throwing and having the time to throw out their failures and do those kinds of things, and to work back and forth and to not think that they know everything. I mean, that's sort of always been my experience with the best people I've worked with. It has always been that way.
And you mentioned a lot of questions. Could you speak more about the story editor, staff writer relationship? Like, what are the qualities of a good staff writer, aside from asking questions?
Oh, that's really good. That's a really good question. See, that's a good.
Yeah, thank you.
I would say, like, a good staff writer, obviously, the job of a staff writer is to kind of take their own unique voice and talent and kind of funnel it into the voice of the show. And so that's part of that, is like sublimating their abilities into what this show needs. But at the same time, they have their own abilities, and theoretically the difference between their abilities and tastes and sensibilities than mine and the showrunners are useful and helpful in kind of just making things more interesting, and not having everything be just all from one person, which again, it has to feel that way at the end, but if it really does all come from one person, sometimes you just miss, crazy nuances and crazy little tangents and diversions and different jokes and just different things that could come out of a different person's point of view. So I think a good staff writer has to be able to listen and to be in the story break and to participate. A good staff writer has to have the ability to pitch a lot and not feel uh, too good or too bad when things go too well or too not get too down if they kind of like are saying a bunch of things that aren't getting through. But by the way, not getting too attached, like, oh, this one got through. And then it's like, oh, well, that's my baby. And like, that's got to be in the script because that was my one thing. You can't really get too you gotta enjoy things as they come. That's but we can talk about this later, but, like, you gotta find, the happiness and the joy and the celebrations and the wins whenever they come, but you can't get too high or too low at any time.
I was just gonna say, I was talking to John Huss, who's a great writer, and he mentioned don't get too high, don't get too low, as like just kind of the key action
Yes.
for it, like just sustaining a career.
I think that's very true. I definitely try to do that. I think that's something I've taken a lot of pride and thought about, is that not to try to be a level head when, and again, like, this doesn't happen all the time, but when things do, it's like something's due and it's falling apart and like you got to figure it out, to be the level head of like not getting too crazy at that moment, trying to, and just to know that we will figure this out and we will get there.
Yeah.
But I believe very strongly in celebrating the wins. Like, because again, the fact that anything ever gets made and gets on the air is a miracle. I mean, from the 10,000 things that get pitched all the way through the things that get to development to the things that, are tried and then fall apart, at any stage in the thing. And the fact that something gets on the air and is good is such a miracle that I think you have to celebrate all of the wins. So like whenever I'm in development and like you get like and you have you've accomplished a certain milestone, you've gotten over a certain hurdle, you've made it beyond a certain milestone and other, other projects fall apart at, but yours is still going, you gotta celebrate that because that's like now you're not one in, you're one in 10,000 basically. We've gotten this far.
Yeah, and then just to flip it, how have you dealt with professional heartbreak?
I'm very much of the philosophy of like you have to sort of try 9 times to get the 10th thing to happen. And like just in terms of like developing shows and getting on the air, like I think I'm like for 1,000, which I think is pretty good.
Yeah.
But like it's still for 1,000. And you just gotta accept that as part of what this is.
Talking about those 996 projects that
Uh,
didn't work out, nothing is wasted, right? The work that you did is not wasted work. Did you find that those are still relationship builders?
oh yeah, there are definitely good things that come out of all of these experiences. Like I had an overall deal at Disney, a TVA, and I worked on my own pilot for a year and a half there. And, like, that was a good example of, like, 17 amazing months, and then last month, it was not so amazing because they didn't make the show in the end. But it got as far as anything could get without being on the air, and actually we got all the way up to what they called the green light committee, and the green light committee actually said yes, but then somebody else said no. But that's as far as you can get without without making it all the way, and so I take a certain kind of solace in that, but also I learned so much being there, and also when I was there, because that was basically like a boot camp for development. And I was, you're there every day, and they're showing you things. They gave me a mentor who was amazing, who sort of taught me a ton of stuff. And um, but I also my office was right next to this guy named Sanjay Patel, and he was this Pixar director who had come down to
Yes.
make his own show, and he left there and took it to Netflix. And so then when I left a few like 6 months later, I followed him there, and then I became his development writer for Ghee Happy when he was there, and then, and then the story editor of that show, and that would not have happened without the that's an example of what I'm talking about. And another example of that, by the way, is that then we were at Netflix making Ghee Happy, and by the way, when I say I was a development writer, I mean, Ghee Happy is absolutely 1,000%, Sanjay. I just sort of, helped around the edges, but, and sort of managed the writing and sort of and helped with the writers, but so I don't wanna say like whatever. He was the creator of that show, 1000%. But, so that was an amazing experience, and, like, we were there during the golden age of, like, Netflix, where, like, I think I was employee, like, 79 of the animation studio, and, like, that was, like, when people look back at, like, "Oh, that was when things were good." That was when things were good. I mean, that was amazing. But at the end, though, there had been a change in the politics in India. This show is a Ghee Happy is about Hinduism and Hindu gods, for kids, and it was meant to be on Netflix here, but also in India. That was why they wanted to make it, and they were making a lot of shows like that for India. But in India, and again, this might be a diversion that you would wanna cut, but it's actually very interesting to me. But,
Yeah.
uh, over the years it took to make Ghee Happy, because again, this is the golden age of Netflix, so they gave us 5 years to make 20 11 minutes. Um
2011.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
5
I mean,
years.
I wasn't there for all of that,
Yeah.
but I was there, and some of this part some time was in development, but I was there for 2 years, for the writing of that, and then the animation took a long time, but it turned out beautifully, and that's the thing, the money was well spent, and it turned out perfectly. But in those years, the government in India had gotten more and more conservative, and actually they passed a law that said, if you air something in India that the government finds offensive, we can put your employees in jail. And so Netflix and Amazon and other people who had been really trying to make a lot of shows for India got very nervous, and they threw them all away. So like hundreds of millions of dollars of shows. Most of these were for adults, with really famous creators. It all got thrown in the garbage and never got seen. But luckily for us, because everybody at Netflix really believed in Ghee Happy and really loved it, they gave it to Sanjay to put on his YouTube channel. And so that was like obviously at that moment we're like, oh man, like this seems like a big disappointment. We worked so hard for so long to make a Netflix show. But then as we said before, like it found an audience on YouTube, and it won the Annie for best preschool show on YouTube, and that became a big thing that I'm super proud of. And and we all are, and so, like, that's the kind of example too of, like, things like where obviously in that moment when we heard, "Oh, they're not going to air it on Netflix," that was obviously not a high moment, right? I mean, that was a disappointment, but it turned out in the end to have, a silver lining for sure.
Curious about just best practices of development. Is there something, a method that you've developed?
When you're pitching something, the big concept is sort of like the price of entry. Like, the big concept of a show is what gets people in the door, gets them to click, but what gets them to stay are the characters. And so, basically, if you're pitching something, you've got that kind of a hooky concept where, like, oh, people are gonna be like, "Oh, I don't think I've seen that before. That's interesting." But even more importantly, you've got an idea for some characters who are like, "Oh, that would be really fun to spend time with them," then that's what makes a show work. So again, when you're pitching, if you've got a hooky concept that you can kind of, in a few examples, get across like how fun and weird that would be to see, and then however many characters you have, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, however many it is, a couple great examples of like these guys are going to be fun to hang out with because when this guy's with this guy, it's like this, and then you have an example of that. But when these two guys meet up with this guy, it's like this, and you have an example of that. And so basically, what you do is through this very very brief pitch, you're telling sort of 3 or 4 stories because you're like, "This world is crazy because this kinda thing happens, and our hero is this kinda guy, and so when he goes into that world and does this, it's like this," and already you've told 2 stories there, but he's got this best friend who's like this, and when they're together, it's like this. It's really funny because they're like this, and now you've told another story, and so by the end of 2 or 3 pages, you've gotten across not everything, of course, and you don't know there's a lot of things you still don't know, but you get a sense of the main characters, you get a sense of what and not only of and not by with adjectives, but by showing, "Oh, it's funny because when they're, like, together, they're like this, but when there's this 3rd guy there, it gets to be like this, and this thing happened this one time when the 3 of them were together, they did this thing because this world is so crazy and has this element in it, they all went off and did this thing," and by the time you get through these 2 or 3 pages, you've really, in a very compact way, introduced the world, the characters, and a bunch of stories because you basically set all of it through story. And that's really all they need to know to get a sense of, like because again, they're not trying to know everything in a pitch. They're just trying to get excited about something. And if you can kinda tell them a few stories in that very kind of concentrated way, then they can be like, "Oh, I don't think I've seen a story like that. And I've never seen a combination of these 3 characters in this kind of a world doing those 4 stories I just heard. Like, I haven't seen that." Like, and again, I haven't seen that was, another boss of mine, that was, like, his highest compliment. It wasn't like, and that's something I learned from him is, like, that's, like, the best thing you could say about something. Like, I haven't seen that before. And so, and again, in a good way, not in a bad way.
Right,
But,
right.
so that's where I've had my most success. And so when you s and in general, I guess that's the way I've sort of trained myself to think. And so when I sit down, and it takes a long time, it doesn't take, like, an hour, but in the end of my first sort of pass through something, that's sort of what I've got is 3 or 4 pages that do those things. And it's not like there's other pieces of things out. I mean, there might be a few things you leave on the cutting room floor, but in general, that's what I've got. That's as far as I've got. And so there's other things to answer for sure, but that I feel like is a time to try to share it with people because if that excites people, it's going to excite them. And if it doesn't, it's no amount of like, uh, sort of figuring all the angles out and figuring out how specifically, how long each act 1 is and all this kind of stuff. That none of that's gonna really matter if that basic pitch doesn't excite people.
That's huge, and that's incredible. It made me think of, there was one time I was writing a show Bible, and I was writing the location section, and I was kinda struggling with it, like, it all felt very generic and flat, like, each location was like, "The marketplace is where you do this and this," and I was trying to figure out, like, why is this kinda why do we care about these locations? And then I realized I needed to be writing about the locations not as places, but as the characters how the characters relate to them.
Right, that's
What are
right.
they doing in the locations that
Right.
make it interesting? And I thought, "Wait a minute, maybe locations are like extended character descriptions, like, kinda in disguise," as, like, a
Yeah.
way to think about it. And hearing you talk about the characters are doing this, and when these 2 characters get together, this happens. It's you're following the characters. It's not that if you really break it down, each section of a longer pitch Bible should be so separate. It should almost be one through line of, like, you're kind of following these
Yes.
characters and, like, and here's the characters in the story engine, and here's the characters in the location. Is that kind of the ballpark of, like,
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think that's what,
huh,
you should try to do because I think that, like,
yeah.
some people confuse and it is confusing, and we can talk about this a little bit more. The process of development is confusing. But, some people confuse, like, a production Bible with a pitch Bible. And, in a production Bible, it is helpful to really, in sort of very, stark and clear detail, lay some things out because then the character designers can be like, "Oh, okay, like, he wears a hat. Okay, that's important for me. I need to know that because 'cause I'm gonna draw the hat." And, the background designers need to the marketplace looks like this. So it's like, okay, they have an idea of where to start in designing the marketplace. But the pitch Bible, that's not what that's about. For the pitch, when you're trying to sell somebody on it, you're just right. It should all be a story. Everything should be a story. So it's like the market. You would only talk about the location. Again, you need to give people a grounding in the beginning of like, okay, this is a just so don't get confused and think it takes place in modern day United States when it really takes place in a medieval fantasy world. You don't want you got to lay some things down pretty quickly and clearly just so people get the right idea in their head to start with. But you would only talk about what happens in the marketplace by telling a story in your pitch Bible because that's again all they want to hear, all they want to they don't well, all they need to know and deep down all they really want to know is just like how what are we going to see on the screen? What's fun about this? Like what's exciting? What's cool? And so the mechanics of how it's going to work in a production are not what you're trying to do. You're just trying to get people hooked on the excitement and potential of it. And so, again, I'm sure you wouldn't have the marketplace if fun things didn't happen there, but that's what you just talk about. And then if people are like, well, how big is it? How tall is it? Then that's for later, right? That's not for today. And when you get people, by the way, saying how big is it, how tall is it, then you got them, you hooked them, right? Because they want to know more. And that's where you want to leave a meeting like that, or at least get to in a meeting like that. And I'm sure you would have all the answers in the back of your pocket, but um, in your back pocket, I guess I should say. But that's not what you're trying to do there. You're just trying to get people excited about the potential of the show. And again, the potential of the show is wrapped up in is the overall concept have a hook that will get people to click, and then when they click, will they fall in love with the characters and want to spend more time with them? And falling in love could be many different things. Doesn't mean they have to be always, super likable, but just that, like, will they want to spend more time with these characters? Because that's really what's gonna keep you coming back again and again.
Mm, you mentioned the word fun, and I heard from Guy that he loves a question that you've asked at least once with dealing with
Yes.
feedback when you were working together, and it was about notes or it was about kind of adjustments in a story, and you had asked, "Is that fun?
Yes.
Would this make it fun?" Can you talk about why that's important?
Well, yeah. Well, because because whatever a guy says is important. I think don't cut that. But no, I think well, so this is the thing, like, so I think that like when you're on a show, when you're the story editor of a show, but even when you're a staff writer, this is important too. Everybody has a job, obviously on the show. The character designers design the characters, the board artists do the storyboards, but even up the chain of like your executive or who's in charge of the network, they all have their jobs too. And their jobs, like at the network, their job is to make sure that the network as a whole makes sense and they're looking out for their identity as a network and making sure that like if you're at Disney, you're making a Disney-like show and that kind of thing. And if and also if you're working with like a uh an existing kind of character, the people who could own that character want to make sure that that character is protected and you're doing things that are good for that character and that character will have a long future and will and won't alienate the existing fans and all that stuff. What your job, though, is as a story editor and staff writer, is to make a show that's fun for the audience, and that's your primary goal, and it's everyone's goal, obviously, but it's not everyone else's primary goal, and so I think that that's the thing that you have to keep in mind is that sometimes, you know so there's a variety of different notes you might get from somebody, some of which are, you know sometimes you get, like, these pure logic notes of, like, would that happen? And sometimes the answer is like, "Well, no, but, like, it's okay, you're not" the real question there is that gonna bump you out of the story? 'Cause it would I mean, if you're talking about, like, a talking animal, going on a flying adventure, it's like, yeah, no, that would not really happen, but
Yeah.
certain things will bump you out of the story, certain things won't, and raising questions like that are important, but sometimes the answer is that's not gonna bump you out of the story, and what we're doing is super fun, and if we're gonna close off that fun avenue to do something boring, that's not a good choice. And in other times, there are things where people are kind of like, you know right, you get notes where people are kind of working through the story and kind of feeling like, "Oh, maybe it would go this way or maybe it would go that way," but the real question to ask is like, if you're gonna go that way, like, what's fun about that? Like, why would you do that? Like, if you're and by the way, you ask yourself that question all the time too. I mean, because it's like you can walk your way through a story that makes total sense, but is not that like why would you do that? Like the story is there. I mean, the story has to make sense because if it doesn't work as a story, it's not gonna be satisfying when you get to the end. You're gonna feel disappointed. It's also gonna be boring, and therefore you're not gonna keep going. And then another level, also, if it's just a jumble of things, you're gonna get kind of bumped out of it. You're gonna be like, I don't even understand what we're doing here. Those things a story obviously has to have, and you want a story to kind of surprise you and compel you and pull you through. And the way it surprises you, pulls you through is you keep surprising the audience with all this fun stuff that like they weren't expecting, and that's really
Mm.
that's what we're trying to do, I think.
That's incredible. I think it's almost like, logic is like the logic in a script is like the editing in a film where you don't wanna notice it. 'Cause as
Right.
soon as you notice it, you're out of the story. And so no one has ever said, "You're gonna love it. It's so logical. You're gonna love this story," right? Like it's like
Right.
that, but you don't want to notice it, and you want to just go for a ride, and that ride is the fun, and you're following the characters, and so that's a great barometer. Is will this bump the audience out of the story or not?
Right, in that case, right, that's not good. You don't wanna do that, and so those things
Mhm.
are definitely important and worth noting. But the primary goal should not be just to not bump the audience out of the story. The primary goal should be to delight and surprise people as you go through it. And the way to, one way to do that is you set up expectations and you subvert them. You surprise people along the way. And another way, there are many ways to do this, but another way to do that is to sort of think about like what's the most fun combination of these elements that you've come up with, and that's really what you should be aiming for. And you have to follow where the characters are going to take you, but you can hopefully point them in a direction, and then they will take you there because they have, their strong personalities that aren't gonna do things that they wouldn't do. But if you can kinda be pointing them in a certain direction, you can get somewhere super fun, and that should be your goal. And so sometimes when, you get to a story that's not working, and that's a different thing too, right? Story's not working and the elements aren't lining up, and you're kind of you're both getting notes and you're giving notes. You're trying to figure out like how to get it to the right place. The thing that sometimes people forget about when they're in that kind of moment of like this isn't working, how do we make it work? They're trying different things. I feel sometimes my role is to say like, well, okay, but like that's a great idea, but what's fun about that? Like that should be the first question you ask yourself as you're pitching solutions to problems.
And just on the subject of development, could you give an example from when you were developing Angry Birds Summer Madness that you still kind of go back to?
Well, one thing that makes me think about this is something I think about a lot is that like um just because I have written a lot of books, I feel like development is more akin in terms of the pacing and the rhythm to writing a book than it is to being in production on a TV show. Um, because like, on a TV show, when you're in production, it's every day, it's constant. There's just no time. Notes come in, they have to go out, everything has to change right away. Things happen very quickly. When you're in development, it's got a much longer time frame like a book does. And also there are much longer intervals between getting getting notes and then turning things back around. Is like, instead of like the next day, it's could be a month, and that's sort of more akin to the pace of writing a book. But especially the other thing too is when you're in development, your development executive uh is actually a lot like a book editor, in my experience, because you really do spend time with them and they do make things a lot better. Like they're really you're kind of on your own, like writing a book as opposed to being in production, which is much more collaborative. But you have this one relationship that's super important. And that's like and so like on Angry Birds, this guy Rob was the guy with me from the very beginning, and he was my partner all the way through, and Rob Doherty. And so he was my guy and my development guy from the very beginning, and then was with me all the way through production too, and as my partner. And he and so like and just like one example of how helpful that was, like, my thought about Angry Birds was like, if you're angry all the time and frustrated, it doesn't make sense to me to have an adult character who got angry all the time, because if you're an adult and you're angry about your neighbor or your boss, you could just quit or you could move, right? What made sense if you get angry and frustrated all the time is if you're a kid, because if you're a kid and your teacher does something that's unfair, you can't just move schools, right? And if your neighbors are kind of jerks and you're a kid, you can't move because you live with your parents. And so my that was sort of my take on Angry Birds, like, that they should be like 13-year-old kids, and that's why that character gets so angry all the time, because you can't there's so many things out of his control that he couldn't change, and so that made him angry and frustrated sometimes. But what Rob's big insight was, like, he had the idea to set it at a summer camp, which is a great place to really bring all those themes to life, because with the parents aren't there and it's just you, and sometimes maybe the camp director or the counselors are being unfair, or there's other older campers who are being a little unfair. And whenever those are the things that kind of set this guy off. And anyway, that was what kind of made that show click. And that's a great example too, like of I've had that happen to me with my editor on books all the time too, where you've got a bunch of stuff that's really great, but they say this one thing that kind of brings it all together. And so in development, your development executive, if you've got a good one, like Rob was, then it really that is a huge, I mean, that's really that's I think what made that one work.
I love the insight of adults have, I mean, there's a certain amount of control.
Yeah.
They could be proactive in, they could solve their own problems, I guess. And kids can't solve them in the same way.
Right.
Hence the frustration, the anger. And it
Yes.
was like, and now let's create an environment where they're all together. And now you have an engine where, oh, this is good. You can see the potential in it, like you're talking
Yeah,
about.
no, for sure, and that really brought it all together, and it was like that was a huge key element of it for sure.
Before we go, I like to ask everybody the same question, which is, what is a rule in our industry that you believe is worth breaking?
Well, I mean, this is probably not a helpful answer, but I do think that words like rule and industry imply a lot more stability and structure to what we do than there really is. I mean, I have, it's only in retrospect, like looking back, like and we talked about this a little bit earlier, but like you look back at like I don't know what it would be like 2014 to 2022 as like this golden age, and like oh man, that was the golden age, and like you talk to people and like everybody says the same thing, but at the time we didn't know that, and at the time there were still ups and downs, right? There were still shows got canceled, and there were still like, "Oh, I gotta find another job," or like, I was pitching this project, or I was in development on this project, and it didn't get greenlit. Now what am I gonna do? And yes, everything always worked out, and yes, like, you can now look back and be like, "That was an amazing time," but when you're in it, you're like, I don't know." I mean, it was just a time, you know? And so I think that, like, I don't know, I think especially nowadays, but always too, it just, you know there isn't as much, there just isn't that kind of st I don't there's not much structure here to kind of have to break any rules, I don't think. I mean, I think it's funny, I know that, talking to a guy, he was saying that, his answer was like, "I love the rules,"
Yeah, right.
and, I do. I almost wish there were more rules that we could count on. I think there are in this business you can really only count on yourself and your friends, and that's and that's a rule I would not break is to always count on yourself and your friends. But there really that's I guess my take on it. There isn't enough. There should be more. It'd be nice if there was more structure and more. And certainly, if you look at the past couple years, whatever structure there was has largely been demolished. And I think something else will replace that we can't quite see yet. And I'm looking forward to that time when we can kind of, and probably we'll only know that when it's done and we look back and we'll be like, oh yeah, that was what that was. And maybe it's happening already and we can't see it yet. But I'm looking forward to being able to see that.
It goes back to that, which you touched on earlier, which is just got to keep going.
Yeah, you just got to keep going, and you got to like, and if as things around you change, you have to, swim in those tides and kind of figure out how to get around whatever obstacles are there and get your stuff done. I mean, the one constant is, and I think, and honestly, now is maybe one of the better times for this kind of thing. The one constant is like the reason why we do that. I think the reason why we do this stuff, or at least for me, is like you have a handful, or some people have more, but a handful of these stories that you want to tell. They're your stories that you want to get out there, and now may be one of the better times actually for doing that in some ways. But as long as you are always sort of kind of angling towards that, like you've got you've got these stories, whether they come out as a book or whether they come out as a show or a movie, but you've got this thing you need to say. And as long as you're always working towards that without whatever else you do in the meantime, then you'll be okay. Then you'll figure it out.
Scott, this was so
Well,
insightful.
thank you for doing that.
This was just so fantastic, and I can't thank you enough for coming on and taking this.
No, well, thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
Hey, before you go, thank you for listening. If you want more episodes like this, make sure to hit that follow or subscribe button. And while you're at it, grab my free guide, The Rule Breaker's Guide to Finding Your Creative Voice. It's a brutally honest roadmap I put together, built from the lessons, mistakes, and breakthroughs I've collected along my journey as a writer. You can download it for free at storyseriespodcast.com. See you in the next one.